Welcome to the Second Industrial Revolution. It began after the Civil War and continued until the First World War in 1914. The Second Industrial Revolution was caused by a public need for more goods. Child labor was a huge theme during the Second Industrial Revolution. Children worked 10 to 14-hour shifts with minimal breaks. By 1900, 18% of America's workers were under the age of 16. The use of child labor came from a need of workers in new factories powered by a surge of coal and other new natural resources. Coal was critical to the U.S. during the Industrial Revolution. Coal was able to replace wood as the preferred fuel because it was cheaper and more efficient in steam engines. Soft coal was popular in factories because it was easier to burn. By 1900, the U.S. was a leading producer of coal. It powered factories, ships, and locomotives. In 1903, Ford Motor Company was founded. Coal was used to power its factories. Henry Ford introduced his Model T in 1908. Ford broke the record for most automobiles sold in his first year by selling 10,000 vehicles. Ford went on to introduce the mass production method, which included a large production plant, interchangeable parts, and the assembly line. Ford introduced the assembly line in 1913. Ford hoped the assembly line would make his cars cheaper and appeal to the masses. Ford modeled his assembly line after the conveyor belts in many grain warehouses. The assembly line broke the car up into 84 separate pieces. The use of interchangeable parts ensured that each car would be exactly the same. Profit margins increased and the time required to assemble a car drastically decreased. By 1924, Henry Ford finally reached the masses with a sturdy and cheap car like he had always envisioned. Another improvement in transportation came from the Wright brothers. The Wright brothers were successful in flying the first free-controlled flight of a power-driven plane. The feat was led by Wilbur, and soon Orville joined as an equal collaborator. Wilbur tested an idea at a 5-foot biplane height. Their experiment was a success, but the brothers knew that wind played a huge role in planes. The first plane test occurred in 1900 in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. They tested a 17-foot glider by working the controls from the ground. The plane flew in the air for a total of 10 seconds. They were discouraged but convinced they had achieved lateral and longitudinal control. The brothers lengthened the glider to 22 feet. The glider was able to glide 335 feet. In 1902, they added 32-foot-long wings to the glider and vertical tails. When they tested the plane, the wing had a tendency to dip towards the ground. Wilbur thought a movable tail would stop this problem. They attempted 600 more glides that year. On December 17, 1903, Orville flew the plane for 12 seconds on a remote beach. The planes were not perceived well in the U.S. France was more willing to try the planes. In 1907, the Wright brothers negotiated with the Army for them to purchase aircrafts. No other airliner could produce what the Army wanted. In June of 1909, the brothers were successful in meeting the requirements expressed by the Army. Their final requirement was to have the plane fly 10 miles with a passenger. Their plane was able to reach a speed of 42.5 miles per hour. The Wright brothers are considered to be the first to create a military airplane. Another great accomplishment in transportation occurred with the Transcontinental Railroad. The railroad helped make the idea of manifest destiny real. The United States felt much smaller now that it only took 3.5 days to travel from New York to San Francisco when it before had taken 4 months. The federal government gave contracts to 2 companies, the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad. The Central Pacific Railroad broke ground in Sacramento, California on January 8, 1863. The Union Pacific Railroad started that same year in December in Omaha, Nebraska. While the Central Pacific Railroad relied heavily on Chinese immigrants to work on the construction of the railroad, the Union Pacific Railroad utilized Irish immigrant labor. All the work had to be done by hand. There was a gap in construction because of the Civil War. The railroads finally met at Monterey Summit, Utah on May 6, 1869. The Transcontinental Railroad allowed for towns to be established and flourish in the West. Within 10 years of completion, the railroad was shipping $50 million worth of freight every year. The railroad established 4 time zones so passengers could plan their trips. The Transcontinental Railroad required people for office and administrative tasks, which created white-collar jobs. Some of the wealthiest men of the time built their fortune from railroads. The railroad would not have been completed if it hadn't been for steel. Steel was used for the tracks and cars. Steel replaced iron because it was less expensive. It was used to build the first skyscraper in 1890. Steel is an alloy of iron and carbon. Henry Bessemer developed the first process for manufacturing steel inaccessibly in 1856. The Bessemer process is carried out in a large avoid steel container lined with clay or dolomite. The capacity of a converter is 8 to 30 tons of molten iron, with the usual charge being around 15 tons. At the top of the converter is an opening, usually tilted to the side, through which the iron is introduced and the finished product removed. The bottom is perforated with a number of channels called tuveres, where air is forced into the converter. The converter is pivoted on turnings so that it can be rotated to receive the charge, turned upright during conversion, and then rotated again for pouring out the molten steel at the end. The Second Industrial Revolution created division between wealthy and poor regarding technology. Oil was another natural resource that became popular during the Second Industrial Revolution. Oil was first drilled in Pennsylvania. It was discovered by Edward Drake in 1859. Oil is extracted from petroleum and is used as a clean burning fuel for domestic heating and lighting. Oil led to one of the largest monopolies in the United States, Standard Oil. Standard Oil was started by John D. Rockefeller in 1870. They held control of 95% of the country's oil refining capacity by the 1880s. Rockefeller made Standard Oil a monopoly it became through horizontal integration, the process of companies putting pressure on competitors and forcing rivals to merge their companies into a common conglomerate. Standard Oil created the first oil trust, a small group of associates that held stock from a group of combined firms, managing them as a single entity. Monopolies like Standard Oil aided the U.S.'s growing wealth. The United States further grew in wealth with the invention of Morse's telegraph. The telegraph was invented in 1837. Electrical signals were transmitted through a wire laid between stations. Morse code used a series of dots and dashes assigned to each letter in the alphabet. The code allowed for a simple communication of more complex messages. The new technology was promising enough to encourage Congress to foot the bill for a test line between Baltimore and Washington in 1843, and within a year the experiment had proved successful. The cost of stringing the cables was between $100 and $200 per mile. By the 1850s, there were telegraph stations in major eastern and midwestern cities. In October 1861, the first transcontinental telegraph cable was completed. The telegraph had the greatest impact on the journalism industry. National news was able to spread quickly using the telegraph. The telegraph industry was threatened by the 1876 invention of the telephone. The telephone was invented by Alexander Graham Bell. Bell was the first to design a practical device for transmitting the human voice through electrical currents. His telephone was sparked by Bell's interest in the human ear. The first message using a telephone was, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you," in Bell's laboratory. The telephone was the nation's first official patent. Bell and his inventors formed the Bell Telephone Company in 1877, now known as AT&T. Bell's invention prospered into a common household object. Thomas Edison also created a revolutionary product. Edison is most commonly known for his light bulb. Edison was not the first to invent the light bulb. Light bulbs had been around but were not used inside homes because they were considered too bright. Edison invented a new system of electrical lighting. This meant light bulbs, electricity generators, wires to get the electricity from the power station to the homes, fixtures for the light bulbs, and more. Edison's toughest problem was finding the right material for the filament. In 1879, after testing more than 1,600 materials for the right filament, including coconut fiber, fishing line, and even hairs from a friend's beard, Edison and his workers finally figured out that carbonized bamboo was the best option. Edison tested his system on a large scale on September 4, 1882, when Edison's Pearl Street station gave electricity to lights in 25 buildings. The light bulb was not Edison's only invention. Edison paved the way for the movie industry with his kinetograph and kinetoscope. The kinetograph was a motion picture camera, while the kinetoscope allowed for the viewing of silent movies. The first kinetoscopes were called peep shows because only one person at a time could watch. They soon grew to allow for more viewers. Edison had also had success in the sound industry. Edison invented the phonograph in 1877 after working with telegraphs. His original intention for the phonograph was for them to be used in offices for dictating letters. He had never realized the entertainment potential behind the phonograph. The phonograph was able to bring music to people's homes. Edison ran recording studios to supply the phonographs with music. The U.S. would not have been able to advance without Edison. The Second Industrial Revolution catapulted the U.S. to the front of powerful nations and brought on a new national identity.